Hi, I'm Jacob Hornberger, Libertarian candidate for president, and I'm here on the road, heading back home to Virginia on Sunday, March 10th. I just participated in the debates at the Illinois Libertarian Party State Convention, and then last night, Saturday night, at the Michigan Libertarian Party State Convention. I've already done a post-debate commentary on the Illinois convention, so this is going to be one of my world-famous on-the-road political commentaries on the Michigan convention, specifically the debate. So they came up with a brand new formula for this debate, which was actually not called a debate. They made it clear they did not want a debate. They wanted what was called a roundtable discussion. So it was kind of like an informal thing. People had dinner, and then right after the dinner, the moderator introduced us all, and we're like sitting on couches and chairs. It's kind of like a living room type format. And the format was the type of which I had never seen before, and I must confess I was a little skeptical, but it turned out to be an absolutely fantastic format. It just was great. What it was they didn't have opening statements, but they said, the moderator said, I'm going to ask each of you a particular question, and each question was different. And he said that after you answer your question, you can talk about whatever you want. And so each person had 5 minutes, which in the customary tradition of Libertarian Party debates is an extraordinarily large amount of time. It's fantastic. You know, one of my real beefs with some of these debate formats is that you get 1 minute for an opening statement. Well, what can you say in 1 minute to really let people know your vision as to what you want to do with the presidential campaign? Is very, very difficult. And then 1 minute answers, and they have this rapid fire questions, and some of them are not really real provocative, thoughtful questions. Some of them are kind of inane, to be honest with you, sometimes. But last night was totally different. It was just fantastic. So he gives each person 5 minutes to explain what really your campaign is all about. And so I used those 5 minutes, and they recorded it. They weren't live streaming it, so they'll be posting it before too long, and I really invite you to watch this thing. What I did was I explained very carefully that I want to move this party in a totally different direction than what we've been doing for the last 20 years or so. We've been advancing socialism in our campaigns, and we continue to do so. Most of my opponents in this race are vociferous advocates of Social Security and Medicare. They say that they want to continue these socialist programs for at least one generation, 25 years. And I think this is a disaster for a message. I mean, as I said last night, our job in this party is to lead America to freedom. That's really our job. I guarantee Republicans and Democrats are not going to lead America to freedom. They are the destroyers of our freedom. That's what they've been doing for decades, destroying our freedom. So you can't count on them to lead America to freedom. The only hope for leading America to freedom is the Libertarian Party. But that's not going to happen when we're advancing socialism. And Social Security and Medicare are the crown jewels of American socialism. And you can go all the way back to the South Carolina debate. You can see how vociferous my opponents are, most of my opponents, and that they're just adamant that we've got to continue these socialist programs. Well, I totally disagree with that. You know, they say people will be dying in the streets. Pure nonsense. America lived without socialism for more than 100 years, and there were not people dying in the streets. It's the exact opposite. Freedom brings out the best in mankind, and both with respect to helping people out, your parents, grandparents, other people. Churches of America are filled with faith-filled people that are always willing to help others out in need. And so we have to lead America. This is what leadership is. Standing for what's right and making the case for what's right. What's right is freedom and voluntary charity. You know, my opponents have taken me to task for lack of compassion, lack of caring, because I want to dismantle these socialist programs immediately without hesitation. Because I know freedom works. Freedom brings out the best in mankind. But there is no care or compassion. This is what socialism does to people, including libertarians. It convinces them, it causes them to be convinced, or to convince themselves, that they're being caring and compassionate by supporting a program that's based on the initiation of force through the coercive apparatus of taxation of the Internal Revenue Service. There is no care or compassion in this system. So when they say, "Oh, I'm really being caring and compassionate, we got to take care of people here," it's pure nonsense. You're being caring and compassionate with money that's been stolen from other people. That's not care and compassion. Compassion is what comes out of the willing heart of the individual. And it's the same with Medicare. Medicare destroyed the finest healthcare system in the world. That's what we had. When I was growing up, there was no Medicare or Medicaid. And I grew up in what was the poorest city in the United States, according to the Census Bureau, Laredo, Texas. And the doctor's offices were filled with poor people, including some from Nuevo Laredo, Mexico. And the doctors knew that half the people there couldn't pay their bills. And the doctors never turned away anyone. And they were still they were the second wealthiest people in town, second only to the oil people, because they were making money off people who did pay. But that they would give back to the community in terms of free care for the poor. And it was the same with our hospital. We had one hospital in town called Mercy Hospital, Catholic hospital, relied on donations. This is what genuine care and compassion is all about. Prices were low. Nobody had major medical insurance. Nobody needed it. Going to the doctors was like going to the grocery store. Well, in the old days, going to the grocery store. Now, I mean, prices are soaring there because of the Federal Reserve's printing antics. But back when going to the grocery store was, you just go in there and buy your groceries and pay. That's what going to the doctors was. It was just a regular, kind of like an expense. And then Medicare and Medicaid come in and they destroy all this. That's the reason for the healthcare crisis. And so if you want to end the healthcare crisis with soaring prices, there's only one way, and that's to get rid of the cause of the problem, which is Medicare and Medicaid. You got to repeal these things. But my opponents don't want to do that. They say, "Oh no, we're going to reform the system with health savings accounts or something called direct medical care." And it's pure nonsense. You cannot reform socialism. But it's a bad message. It's a bad message for a party that purports to stand for liberty. Same thing like with school vouchers. This is just a socialist educational reform vehicle that my opponents favor in this race. Uses taxation, the initiation of force, to give money to other people to fund their children's education. The classic socialist system. I oppose all this. And immigration controls. Classic social system is based on central planning. That's why you have the crisis, the chaos, the death, the suffering, the police state, the Berlin Wall, the concertina wire. This is what comes with socialism. Just look at the Soviet Union. And so, for 20 years we've been advocating this socialism, including right now in our presidential campaigns. And I'm saying this is a bad message for this party. For one thing, it's not freedom. Okay, it's defined as libertarian. I don't deny that, but it's not freedom. Freedom means the dismantling of infringements on freedom. If all you do is reform infringements on freedom, you haven't accomplished freedom. You've improved the serfdom under which people live, maybe, but you haven't achieved freedom. And our job is to lead America to freedom, which means necessarily the restoration of our principles in this party of freedom, free markets, and voluntary charity. So that's what I set forth in my vision last night, in my 5-minute talk. I said, this is what I want to do. I want to move this party in an entirely different direction. I pointed out we're at 0% in the polls now. That's the latest presidential poll. Libertarian Party candidate, 0%. And, the answer of some of my opponents is, "Oh, well, they just don't know our message, Jacob. If they knew our message." What do you mean they don't know our message? We've been running this message for 20 years. Social Security reform, Medicare reform, healthcare reform, educational reform, drug war reform, reform, immigration reform. Of course people know our message, but they're rejecting it because there's no constituency out there for this message. This is what my opponents are having a very difficult time understanding. There's no block of voters out there that are enthusiastic about this message coming out of a Libertarian Party presidential candidate. Oh yeah, the Republicans. I mean, yeah, big popular message among the Republicans. But just because it's popular among the Republican Party doesn't translate into success for a Libertarian Party presidential candidate that is advocating socialism. And so I want this party to move in a completely different direction and give the American voters this time around something they're not expecting. A campaign of pure principle, based on pure principles. So I laid that out in my first 5-minute block. Well, then he has a second round. The moderator has a second round, totally different questions, and a different question for each candidate. So a lot of thought went into this. So the second question says to me, what do you think about Milei there in Argentina with what he's doing? Well, my answer was I really haven't kept track of what he's doing as president, but my understanding was that when he was campaigning, he was carrying around a chainsaw, to let people know that he was going to really dismantle all the illegitimate functions of government. And I'm almost certain, I'm not positive, that he was appealing to the lower classes, economic classes. Because, see, the upper classes, they may get hurt by inflation, which is extremely high in Argentina, but they can adjust, just like here in the United States, Republicans, which are middle class, well-to-do, they can adjust to inflation. But as I've long argued, they're not going to go with a radical message of libertarianism. Our message is radical, properly understood. Now, it's not radical if you're talking about saving Social Security over the next 25 years and saving Medicare. These are not radical messages. Saving public schooling, saving, the whole healthcare central planning, saving the immigration control system, modifying it, streamlining it. This is not a radical message of my opponents. My brand of libertarianism, which is the genuine principles of liberty, which means dismantling infringements on freedom, that's a radical message. And it has long been my conviction that your average Republican is never going to go with that, which is one of the reasons why this message has been watered down over the last 20 years, because we've been trying to appeal to Republicans. And the way you appeal to Republicans is you start reaching out to them and meeting them where they are and saying, okay, we're not going to abolish Social Security and Medicare anymore. That's out. We're not going to call for legalization of all drugs, just marijuana, or just get rid of asset forfeiture or mandatory minimum sentences. But they're never going to vote for this radical message. But the lower economic classes that are getting crunched, like by inflation, those are our voters. And this is what I'm sure Milei understood with the high inflation rate in Argentina. So he goes in there and campaigns. And so I argued that this is what I want to do. And so in the second block of 5 minutes, I said, look, let me just outline what I'm talking about here. I'm not just talking esoterically about, let's run a campaign of principle for the party of principle. I mean, I believe that, but I'm talking about straight politics here. Like on immigration controls, that this is a great opportunity for us, but only with open borders. With advocating immigration controls, which is what all my opponents in this party favor, and it's been the flow for 20 years, okay? That just don't call for open borders, just don't make it a radical message, just soften it up and say, well, we want to let in more immigrants, or we want the government to be more benevolent, and we're going to streamline the system, and so forth. The idea is we can get Republican votes, and that's always the targeted audience of our presidential campaigns, Republicans. I mean, that's the whole idea of school vouchers. Democrats are never going to vote for a candidate that supports school vouchers. So it's bad if we meet Republicans with school vouchers. Republicans love school vouchers, okay? And so the target audience is always Republicans, but it never works. I mean, that's the whole idea of this is the party of Ron Paul. It's not the party of Ron Paul. Ron ran as a Republican when he had that big surge of votes. But the idea is, we'll target the Ron Paul voters. They'll come over and vote for us. And we'll soften our message. We'll water down our message for reform. Never works. So there is no constituency out there. There's no big block of voters that are enthusiastic about this thing. So what I'm saying is, let's run a guerrilla campaign. My opponents keep modeling their campaigns and what they're going to do with the presidential campaign. And you saw it last night on the campaigns of the big party candidates. We're going to get millions of dollars in, and we're going to do some advertising, and we're going to garner all these votes and all this. And you can't run a campaign like this against the major party candidates. We'll never have their amount of money. Even if you get in $5 million, it doesn't compare to what they have. And so what do? You got to run a guerrilla campaign. This is how the North Vietnamese and the Viet Cong beat U.S. forces. They ran a guerrilla kind of campaign against them. And this is what we got to do to beat these guys, the major parties. And that's what I was talking about last night. Okay, you take open borders. I garner the votes of every single person out there that's horrified by what's going on the border. My opponents can't do that because they're advocates of immigration controls. And every single right-wing proponent of immigration controls is going to go vote for Donald Trump. So this position, which was designed to get Republican votes, gets 0 votes because no Republican or right-winger is going to waste his vote on an LP presidential candidate that favors immigration controls. It's just not going to happen. 0 votes. And that's where we are in the latest presidential poll, by the way, 0%. All right, and it makes sense. Why would they waste their vote on an LP presidential candidate when the real enchilada on border control is Donald Trump? All right, but take my position. Okay, now we're talking about guerrilla warfare. There's people all along the border and around the United States that are horrified by what's going on the border. The concertina wire, the death, the suffering. It's been going on for decades. There's people on the border that hate the Border Patrol. They just don't know there's a viable alternative, but they're looking for leadership. We need to provide that leadership, and that leadership is open borders. And it's not just me. If you look at some of the books that are coming out, brand new book called The Case for Open Borders by a guy named John Washington. It's one of the best books you'll ever read. It addresses all the standard objections. What about the welfare state? What about the invasion? What about everybody coming to the United States? It addresses every one of them. And then there's my book, the book I co-edited, called The Case for Free Trade and Open Immigration. There's Jason Riley's book, Let Them In, The Case for Open Borders. He was a former member of the editorial board of the Wall Street Journal. Brian Kaplan, the esteemed economics professor at George Mason. This is the future. And by providing a viable alternative to all of these people that are horrified, that are looking for leadership, looking for a viable alternative, I garner all those votes. That's a guerrilla warfare, okay? And I also said, look, we got to target blacks because this drug war is the most racist government program since segregation. Every black in this country knows that blacks receive disproportionately higher jail sentences and stops and searches and asset forfeiture. They stop blacks much more often on the highways and steal their money. The authorities do. And they know that people, when you steal all their money, they can't go hire a lawyer to get it back. And if you take, for example, Michelle Alexander, I'm willing to bet that if you did a survey of American blacks, 80% of them would know who Michelle Alexander is. I would say 3% of white Americans would know who she is. Well, she's a black academician, very renowned, that has written this fantastic book called The New Jim Crow. She's talking about the drug war. It is the new Jim Crow. And blacks have been oppressed by this. Not every black gets busted for drug violations, but they've got to relate when they see it happening. And that's our target audience there. And I'm going to give you an example of this. I ran for U.S. Senate in Virginia 20 years ago against one of the most popular governors in the history of the state. I've pointed this out in previous commentaries, John Warner, chairman of the Armed Services Committee. This is right after the 9/11 attacks. I was saying what Ron Paul would say 6 years later, that the motivating factor behind those attacks was U.S. foreign policy. So I wasn't targeting Republicans for votes. I didn't care that I didn't get one vote for a Republican. I think this whole thing of targeting Republican votes for the last 20 years has been a disaster. The Democrats didn't run anybody, but I knew that I wouldn't get any Democrat votes because I was going after them too. Because I'm criticizing their support of Social Security, Medicare. I'm calling for the repeal, public schooling. no Democrat was going to vote for me, and I knew that. But I ran a campaign of total principle, just like I am today. My principles have not changed at all. In fact, there was a person after the Arizona convention that said, Jacob's principles are so anachronistic. He hasn't changed a bit. And I thought, well, that's a compliment. She didn't mean it as a compliment, but what she means by that is that I haven't adopted health savings accounts and school vouchers and Social Security privatization and Medicare, all of these newfangled libertarian positions that keep socialism intact. All right, so I end up with 7% of the statewide vote with this message of principle, proving that there's a constituency out there. And I told them that last night, this second 5-minute block of time that I got extended to 7 minutes because they let you have an extra 2 minutes if you wanted to opt in for the extra 2 minutes, so I did. And I explained to them that this was a campaign of pure principle, which shows there's a constituency out there. This is 7% of the statewide vote. 20 years ago. I have no doubts that constituency is still out there and has doubled or tripled in size over the last 20 years. That's why I keep contending we don't have to settle for 0 to 1%. Well, you have to settle for it if you run the same kind of campaign we've been running of this, Republican light, reform-oriented message. But if you run a campaign of principle, I have no doubts that 7% I got can double. That's why I keep saying a campaign of principle will produce a breakout of 10 to 15%. This is not just pie in the sky stuff. This is based on a campaign of principle 20 years ago. Well, as part of that campaign, I went and met with a pastor from the Alfred Street Baptist Church in Alexandria, Virginia. This man is one of the most renowned ministers in the country. He later got elected to the African American Hall of Fame. And he didn't know me from Adam. And I didn't have any money. I'm running a straight guerrilla campaign here. And so I met with him, and he agreed to meet with me, which is a big honor right there. But I explained to him, I said, Pastor Peterson, I'm going to tell you what I stand for, and I stand for open borders. What the government's doing to people there on the border is horrific. It violates every principle of Christianity. Thou shalt love thy neighbor as thyself, God's second greatest commandment. And I said, I stand for legalizing all drugs. This is the most racist government program since segregation. I stand against Social Security, Medicare, the whole welfare state. Making people dependent on government is a very, very bad thing. And then, of course, the national security state that got us into Vietnam and sacrificed how many black soldiers who had been conscripted, and then they're fighting for freedom, supposedly. That's what they were told. Dying for freedom, and then they come back to a segregated society. And then they go after people like Muhammad Ali and destroy his career, at least at the height of his career, because he dared to oppose this destructive, immoral, illegal war. And then, of course, targeted Martin Luther King for opposing the war. At the end of this conversation, Pastor Peterson says, Mr. Hornberg, he knew I couldn't win. But he says, Mr. Hornberger, I'm going to endorse your candidacy, and I want you to take this letter of endorsement to every black minister in the state. You tell them I'm endorsing you. And I did. And I have no doubts to this day that was the lion's share of my 106,000 votes. Because I was also campaigning at concerts where blacks were attending, picnics. I'd go out there and hand out my campaign card. And then also Hispanics, though. There's a considerable Hispanic community in Virginia, and so I wanted the word to spread. And this is part of a guerrilla tactic. You don't rely on advertising in the mainstream press because you don't have that kind of money. You rely on word of mouth. And so I would go into migrant day things where they were just hiring themselves out for the day, and I'd pass out my card, talk to them in Spanish, tell them what I was doing, and I knew word would spread. That there's a candidate that's saying open borders. And people would say, ojalá, if only we could do something like this. And so I knew word would spread, and so I know a large portion of my votes came from Hispanics as well. This is how you run a guerrilla campaign. You don't target the Republican Party for votes. You don't target the Democrat Party. You don't target the upper classes that are never going to go with a radical message. You target the people who are being victimized by the welfare warfare state. And so that's what I outlined last night as to what I want to do. I want to move this party in a totally different direction from my opponents, okay? And I pointed out, like, in this race, we're all friends. We've become friends, all the presidential candidates. And I think we have mutual respect. Well, I know we have mutual respect for each other, and we get along well. We just have different visions as to what we want to do with this party. They want to keep going with the flow that we've been doing for 20 years, the flow that has now led to 0% in the polls, down from 1.1%. I want to move America and this party in a totally different direction. You can't move America in a different direction until you get this party moving in the direction of its founding principles of freedom, free markets, and voluntary charity. If we move this party in the direction of our founding principles and away from socialism, then we can lead America to freedom. And that was what I outlined last night. So it was really a great format, at least because it enabled me to explain to people what exactly I have in mind here. Not only moving the party in a different direction, message-wise, totally different direction, but also how this translates into a guerrilla campaign, a guerrilla warfare against these people who have destroyed our liberty. And so I wrapped up saying, look, we had a short opening and a closing statement of 2 minutes. I said, let's go into battle with our principles. These are our weapons. Let's fight as libertarians, not as Republican lights, not as welfare warfare state reformers. This time around, let's go into battle against the people who have destroyed our freedom with our principles, our weapons. Our principles are our weapons. And then going into battle, let's seize the day. I'm Jacob Holmberger, Libertarian candidate for president. My campaign website is jacobforliberty.com.